This is Duke University.
And now on behalf of the Sanford School, I would like to welcome you to the Crown Lecture in Ethics for 2016. The Crown Lecture in Ethics brings speakers to campus to discuss compelling ethical issues in the fields of art, science, medicine, business, and public policy. Why are we interested in ethics? When Terry Sanford founded this school, he did so with a deliberate emphasis on ethics, a conviction that rigorous analysis needs to be coupled with an abiding awareness of the fact that policy choices inevitably produce conflicts over values. Our students come to understand and learn to be thoughtful about trade-offs involved in such conflicts. As a result, Sanford has a course on ethics, which remains a required part of our core curriculum. In addition, our Heart Leadership program offers courses that address moral courage and how such courage is important to effective leadership. Our DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy teaches a required course called News as a Moral Battleground. And this is just the beginning of our focus on ethics. Because of our strong commitment to teaching about ethics, we are pleased to have the opportunity to talk with award-winning biologist, Professor Tyrone Hayes. He joins distinguished company that includes last year's Crown Lecturer, Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright Tony Kushner. Previous Crown Lectures have been given by Children's Defense Fund founder Marian Wright Edelman, Nobel Peace Prize winner Shirin Ebadi, and scientist and author Jared Diamond, to name only a few. The lecture series itself is made possible by a gift from Lester Crown and the Crown family, who are longtime friends and supporters of Duke University and have served the university in many capacities. We are grateful for their support and vision in choosing ethics as the focus for an annual talk to the Duke community. Sanford professor Philip Bennett will engage Dr. Hayes in a conversation about his research and its impact. Professor Bennett is the Eugene Patterson Professor of the Practice of Journalism and Public Policy. Phil is a former managing editor of the Washington Post. In addition to serving on our faculty, he has been the managing editor of Frontline, a PBS documentary program. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Hayes. Tyrone Hayes is professor of integrative biology at the University of California, Berkeley. He is known for his research findings regarding the effects of the herbicide, otherwise known as a weed killer, atrazine, which he has studied for more than 15 years. The chemical is an endocrine disruptor, and Professor Hayes' research shows it seriously altered the reproduction of frogs. Other scientists around the world have since expanded on his findings, suggested that the herbicide may be associated with other human maladies in both humans and in animals. Syngenta, the Swiss manufacturer of atrazine, according to some, launched a campaign to discredit both Professor Hayes and his research. A 2012 article in Mother Jones magazine called The Long-Running Conflict Between Professor Hayes and Syngenta one of the weirdest feuds in the history of science. We will hear from him about that experience. Raising questions about the research or the researcher is a tactic companies often use to fend off regulation. The tobacco industry, for example, delayed regulations by questioning the science about the health effects of secondhand smoke, and there are many additional examples. Professor Hayes has presented hundreds of papers, talks, and seminars worldwide on his conclusions that environmental chemical contaminants have contributed to global amphibian declines, as well as to health disparities among minority and low-income populations. Please join me in welcoming our 2016 Crown Lecturer in Ethics, Professor Tyrone Hayes.
Welcome, Dr. Hayes.
It's my pleasure.
So what we're going to do, we're going to talk for about 45 minutes or so, 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. So I hope you're formulating those if you don't already have them in mind. So let's get started. I thought we'd talk a little bit about your research, and then a little bit about the reaction to your research, and then finish up with some of the implications that we're seeing today. And I thought that I'd start with the frogs. So you grew up in Columbia, South Carolina, and I saw in a documentary film about you that in the neighborhood where you grew up, when the rains came, the water rose, and when the water rose, the frogs and the snakes came out with that. And from a young age, you were fascinated with that. Why?
I think as long as I can remember, I've been fascinated with biology and really with life. And biology, of course, literally means the study of life. And like most kids, I think I wondered about things like how do birds know when to fly south and when to come back, and how do tadpoles know when to metamorphose. And just growing up in that environment where, yeah, literally the rains would come, my yard would flood, we'd have turtles and snakes and frogs, and just being around that. And I wonder now, as I continue to go back to the area, how I would have turned out now, because much of that is gone. Much of that is paved over, and much of that wildlife is now gone.
So describe your family living room when you were a kid. You had aquariums and terrariums and collections of all kinds?
I wasn't allowed to bring the animals in the house. That doesn't mean that they didn't end up in the house, but we had, I had lizards and turtles. And my father, when I was in high school, my father actually, I wanted to build a turtle pond. And so every day I would come home after school and dig this hole and dig this hole. And finally my father gave in. He came and he dug the hole with me, and we built this turtle pond and had turtles. But I did experiments trying to examine things like how temperature affected sex determination and reproductive biology ever since I was a little kid.
And so how did you choose science? Or do you remember a point, was it really from a very early age that you latched onto that? Or?
It was as early as I can remember, just being fascinated with life, really.
So then you go to Harvard, you get your doctorate at Berkeley, and you zip through there, and by 1997, you're at Berkeley, and you're asked you're asked by a pharmaceutical company or its agents to begin some research on this drug, atrazine. And at the time, were you familiar with atrazine? How much did you know about it? And how did you begin those experiments?
Yeah, I had never heard of atrazine. Again, my interest was in how the environment was interpreted by animals. So how does a tadpole know when to metamorphose? How does it know to become a male or to become a female, or when to lay its eggs? And it became clear to me that some of the most important factors in the environment that were affecting development and growth and regulation were human-made chemicals that interfered with hormones. And so I had already started venturing down that road of examining how chemicals can interfere with hormones, so-called endocrine disruptors. And then I was hired by the manufacturer to evaluate whether or not atrazine was a so-called endocrine disruptor, and that's how I was introduced to atrazine.
And what was that initial experiment like, and what did you find when you did that?
Initially, I was hired just as a consultant to review the literature and to develop a hypothesis. That went on for maybe a year and a half. I was a brand new, young assistant professor. My wife was in graduate school. I had a new kid, and they were paying me $1,000 a day. Like literally, if I emailed and said, "Hey, I thought about atrazine today," I get a check for $1,000. So it was a very appealing thing.
Remember, this is an ethics lecture, so.
Oh well, but it was consulting, and originally that it was just to do the literature evaluation, and then at the conclusion of that consulting gig, I was a professor at the time. They offered me a research contract to actually develop and study atrazine and figure out if it might be an endocrine disruptor, and it was a job. I accepted it.
And so, how did you determine that it was an endocrine disruptor, and how did that process go? What was that discovery like?
We looked at a range of concentrations that could typically be found in the environment, and we exposed the animals throughout larval development by dissolving it into water, which is how you would really get exposed to this particular chemical. And hypothesis was that it might do something. So we looked at everything. And we looked at things that were aspects of development that were in particular known to be regulated by hormones. And our initial discovery was that the larynx, or the voice box, didn't grow properly in males. And in frogs, male frogs sing and females don't, for the same reason that men have deeper voices than women, testosterone. And so the finding that their voice box didn't grow properly suggested that they were demasculinized or chemically castrated. The company doesn't like me to use that term, so I use it whenever I get the chance. And later, upon analyzing the gonads, we found that a proportion of the animals had female parts as well as male parts, so to speak. So they were both demasculinized, but also feminized, either growing ovaries or in some cases growing eggs in their testes.
So maybe this is a good moment to stop and just sort of say, what is atrazine? What's it used for? How important of a herbicide is it? And put that in a little context.
So atrazine at the time was produced by Novartis. It was at that time not only their #1 selling product, but it was the most widely used herbicide in the world. It's since been displaced by glyphosate or Roundup. Not because we use less atrazine, but just now we use more glyphosate. It's mostly used on corn, but it's also used in some places on golf courses and Christmas tree farms and in forestry. So after they cut the trees, they apply it so that weeds don't grow up.
And I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but just to foreshadow why this becomes a big problem for them, your results. I looked at the Syngenta, which now Novartis sold that unit to Syngenta, and on their website it says, defining atrazine, it says, for more than half a century, atrazine has been a mainstay of corn, sorghum, and sugarcane farmers for its proven control of a broad range of destructive weeds. Each year it supports up to 85,000 American jobs while saving consumers up to $4.8 billion due to decreased input costs and increased production, which is something I'm sure you've heard many, many times over. So we'll get to that in a minute when we talk about what their interests were in countering your research. But when you report these initial findings back to then Novartis, what's their initial reaction?
So initially, I reported the initial findings, and we had a huge sample size, but I initially reported just a few samples and said, well, maybe we should do some more. And so we analyzed more samples, and that was fine. And then it seemed like they were trying to slow down the progress, and because with each set of samples that we analyzed, the problem got worse. It didn't get better. And then eventually, I said we should repeat the experiment. We should see if it's reproducible. And again, they started to slow down and not provide the money at the rate that we could work. And then they asked me to manipulate the data in ways that were inappropriate to try to make it go away. And at that point, I quit. At that point, I left the contract.
So, and that was an early, I imagine, ethical issue that you were wrestling with when you were seeing the emerging results and then feeling the pressure from them. And yet, you had a lab, you had employees, and you were to a certain extent financially dependent on them.
At that stage, actually, I was, because I also had federal funding. I had funding from the university. But at that stage, a significant amount of my funding was coming from the company.
So in 2002, just to continue with this chronology, which I think is helpful, you publish on this, on your research, and in 2004, the European Union bans atrazine in use in agriculture in Europe. 2007, you write about potential impact of atrazine on human beings and as a potential contributor to prostate and breast cancer. How much are you learning as you go along? Is this a progressive process of discovery or a bigger sample, or what's happening in the science there?
Well, I often describe myself as a little boy who likes frogs, and I went into this area because I was interested in amphibians. I was interested in how they develop and how they grow, and but now getting involved with this chemical is also, I'm becoming very much aware of and interested in environmental health and environmental justice, and then starting to realize that the impact is not just on frogs. I mean, it's frogs and fish and birds and mammals, including humans. We all make estrogen the same way, it all functions the same way, and so starting to realize that our findings have implications for not just amphibians, not just wildlife, but also for humans, and in particular, minorities are more likely to live in and more likely to work in areas where they're exposed to chemicals that we know are associated with adverse health outcomes. So now really starting to become much more interested in the impact of these chemicals, in particular on factory workers who produce the stuff and on farm workers who are exposed to chemicals like atrazine every day.
So describe that a little bit more. I've seen footage of you near Salinas, in the growing area of California, and how often have you gotten out of the lab and been in the environment where farm workers and others are working, and what kinds of things have you heard there?
Quite often. So we did one of the studies that we published. We actually did a transect all the way across the United States, examining atrazine and the effects on amphibians in the wild. We have another much more substantial study where we examine frogs all the way across the United States. I mean, huge sample sizes. And also we've done work in Salinas examining pesticide mixtures and how they're affecting amphibians and how they're affecting the health and of amphibian populations.
How widespread, to just give us a sense of the scope and impact of atrazine, so I guess that would be, for a non-scientist like myself, it would be sort of how many frogs are affected in a normal frog population, and at what doses do the effects occur?
So we currently use in the United States about 80 million pounds of atrazine every year. The United States is the biggest user. It's the most common contaminant of groundwater, surface water, rainwater. It's estimated that 500,000 pounds of atrazine come down in rainwater every year. It can travel over 600 miles. The U.S. Geological Surveys say that they can measure atrazine in rainwater in Minnesota from applications in Kansas. And in fact, that's why the European Union banned it, because when France banned it, Germany was still using it and was coming over into rainwater from Germany, 1,000 kilometers or 600 miles away. We get effects at levels that are 0.1 parts per billion, and that's about 1/1000th of a grain of salt in 2 liters of water. And atrazine can be in rainwater at 10 parts per billion. It's allowed in drinking water by the EPA at 3 parts per billion. So that's 30 times higher than we're using. It can be in people who live in areas where atrazine is used. It can be in their urine at that levels. And in farm workers and applicators in California, atrazine can be at levels at 240 parts per billion, or sorry, 2,400 parts per billion. So it can be in the urine of farm workers at levels that are 24,000 times what we know to be effective.
And does the EPA acknowledge that at those levels it's harmful for those workers, or what's the regulation on that?
The EPA has just now issued a report on wildlife stating that atrazine is a reproductive toxin and dangerous to plants and animals. Something that I told them 20 years ago. But
right.
And the human assessment for atrazine has yet to come out from the EPA.
So we'll talk about that a little at the end, because it's interesting. In this study that the EPA published over the summer, it's the first time that they've said publicly what you've been saying over the course of this period. So we're in the mid 2005, 2006. You're publishing on this. You're no longer working for the manufacturer. And you discover that while you're studying atrazine, the manufacturer, Syngenta, is studying you. And how do you first become aware that they are trying to collect information on you, and they're trying to move towards or beginning a process of trying to discredit you? What's your first hint of that?
Well, I sort of knew. I mean, they came just as I quit, as I left the contract. They came to the university and they brought a scientist who claimed that he had reanalyzed my data and that we had made errors and these kinds of things. And then they hired several different scientists who claimed that they couldn't replicate our work, and they were putting that out there in the public. And I was aware. I think probably the first time I was aware that they were doing things like hacking my emails and things like that was I was giving a talk at the University of Minnesota, and just by coincidence, a professor from the University of Minnesota, the night before, was in an airport flying back to see my talk, and she overheard somebody in line on her cell phone say, "Yes, we have access to his email, we know where he is at all times," and called my name. And she told me about this, and she stood up and asked about it. And then there was a series of, they would show up at talks, and they would distribute pamphlets and things about me, and would make verbal threats to me.
So we find out, and this is happening to you, so you're aware of it, where it becomes more broadly known is in a lawsuit, a class action suit against Syngenta in 2012. which they eventually settled for over $100 million with communities in Illinois over water. But in that process, in the discovery process, the notes of Syngenta and their records become public, and we find there that they, that they had written down and had records. And I was going through some of that, and it says they made a list of ways to discredit you, and those lists included have your work audited, ask journals to retract your articles, and this is all their language, set trap to entice him to sue.
That's my favorite, set a trap. Who writes that down, right? Yeah. Set a trap.
Set a trap.
It's like Bugs Bunny Road.
Yeah, no one will ever read this. Investigate your funding and even investigate your wife. So how many of those things do you think they actually did?
There were some of the things crossed off. They had things like exploiting my father's health problems. They had things written down, purchasing my name on the internet, trying to get me involved in scandals so that environmental groups would not support me. Long lists of things and they had them categorized as risky, more risky. They had this list of things that they were going to do to me, which was nowhere near the intensity of the things that they actually said to me in person.
So we'll get to that in a second. They did actually buy your name on the internet, didn't they? Or they put up ads?
They put up ads, but there was also a plan to purchase my name on the internet and redirect. Anybody who would search my name would be redirected to their website. They hired, I knew about it. They put up a Wikipedia page on me, and if you look through their notes, they had a list of people that they were going to hire to do that. They wrote papers, they wrote testimony for EPA that apparently, I don't know if they were paid off or what, but they got the EPA to provide false testimony for things.
So maybe let's break this down into two parts, and maybe we can talk first about the attacks on the science, because this comes up, and this is a broader phenomenon that's been written about in other areas with climate or tobacco, Kelly was mentioning. And then talk a little bit about the personal side of it and how that affected you. But on the science part, so they said that, as you mentioned, that your results weren't reproducible, that you didn't share your data. What were some of the things that they went on just to try to discredit the science?
They did claim that I didn't make my data available, which isn't true. They own the data. They had the whole data set. In fact, one of the reasons that we published so late is that I had to repeat all of the work without their funding, because they owned all of those data that I produced under their, and I have documentation from the EPA that they also had access to the data. The EPA audited my entire lab. The EPA were there at my lab when I collected the data. And Ann Lindsay testified in Minnesota that they never saw my raw data. And now when you look back through their notes, you'll see that they wrote notes like, did we provide Ann Lindsay with the testimony? Will she speak to reporters? So whether she was paid off or what, I don't know, but they obviously planted that false information with the EPA. And
just to be clear, what they were alleging here was that atrazine had no effects on endocrine disruption in amphibians or anybody else? That was their position?
Correct. And there are now dozens and dozens of independent studies, including some of their own, but dozens of studies showing that that's not the case. Okay.
So you do something very interesting and unusual, which is you get into the ring with them. So and it's unusual enough for a scientist that some of your colleagues were surprised. So you took them on, you sent them emails, you were vocal in calling them out. You confronted people individually who were confronting you, and you even and then your method, you rapped about atrazine. You created different ways to sort of express how you were, what you were going through there. Tell us a little about that. How'd you make the decision to do that? And
well, I think that I used to make a joke that they had meetings where they were advised on, pardon my language, how to piss off a black guy. And literally now you look through their notes and that's exactly what they had. So they had psychological profiles done, and part of what they played on was really a race card, was the idea of, as a minority scientist, this feeling of imposter syndrome. And so they played on this: you don't dress right, and you don't speak right, and you don't do this right. And so what they tried to do was sort of make me feel uncomfortable in where I was and who I am, and tried to push me into their arena. And what they did was, every time they did it, I took a step out further. So every time they said, well, you can't speak this way, or you can't do this, I showed them that I didn't have to play the game, that that I've been where they are. They've never been where I am.
What do you mean by that?
Meaning that sometimes I would use language and they would say, well, we don't know what that means. I said, well, that's too bad because my vocabulary is as big as yours. It's like you have to learn to speak my language. I already know how to speak yours and I can already publish in the places that you could publish, but you don't know how to. And there was a professional conference where, I don't even remember now, but I said something that rhymed or something, and I got a letter that said, you can't rap. I said, I didn't rap. Is Dr. Seuss rapping? Just because I say something in rhyme, and because I'm black, that makes it rap. And I literally got a notice that said, you're not allowed to do this at a professional conference. The next conference, 15 minutes, my entire talk was in rhyme. Because you can't, it's anyway.
We're going to require all the questions to be in rhyme today. So do you think that was, so I mean, you raise an interesting point. Obviously, they had financial and other incentives to try to approach your work or discredit it or oppose it. Do you think that they also had other incentives because you're black, or that sort of amplified the efforts, that there was something else there?
It's hard to describe. It's an interesting phenomenon. I think they, if you look at, for example, a lot of environmentalists, whether it's Rachel Carson or Theo Colborn, I think in many cases, Sandra Steingraber, in many cases, I think they used, because they were women, they used sort of sexism or intimidating tactics to, again, make you feel like you're not really a scientist, you don't belong. And so I think, if you look at their notes, this is clearly true, that there were things that they would talk about, threats that they would make to my wife and my daughter, or questions about my sexuality. They had clearly been briefed on, well, these are things that culturally that he might be uncomfortable with. And so there was clearly a plan. So they clearly used sort of the race issue to try to get at me and it was usually the things they would say, they would come up to me before a talk or before a presentation or before I testified in Illinois and say things that were meant to throw me off my game.
But they would physically approach you and say something to try to intimidate you.
Or they would email me things like, everybody at the conference thought you were an entertaining fraud, or you're a preacher, you're not a scientist. They would email me these things that were supposed to already, because of that imposter syndrome that many minorities feel. And I think what they didn't understand is, again, part of my language, I've been dealing with that shit all my life. So that's what I mean. So that this kind of bullying and this kind of you don't belong and you have to dress this way kind of thing just. Yeah.
So they escalate. They keep at it. In 2010, they lodge either a complaint or they file some sort of letter with Berkeley saying that that you've engaged in an ethics violation by sending them emails that they consider vulgar or threatening or inappropriate. Yeah. How did that whole effort? Did it affect you at all? Did you think maybe you'd approach things the wrong way? Tell us a little bit about how you reacted to that.
Well, so first off, they were making, both through email and in person, they would make threats. Like they would say, who's with your wife right now? Maybe I sent somebody back to your house. Who's with your daughter right now? Is your daughter at home alone? They would make these kind of threats when I was traveling. You should stay home and take care of your wife, and these kinds of comments. Or at one point in Illinois, they made a comment, I'm going to send some good old boys to show you what it's really like to be gay. They make these comments that were supposedly threatening, and I responded the way that I respond where I grew up. But prior to that, I'd gone to the university. I went to University Lawyer, and I said, look, these guys are harassing me. They're sending me these emails. They're saying these things. And I'll never forget, the university lawyer looked at me and said, yeah, you should get a lawyer. And I said, fool, that's why I'm here talking to you. And I remember he said, well, I represent the university. I protect the university from liability. And I looked at him, I said, universitas, from the Latin, is a collection of scholars and teachers and students. So what is this entity that you represent that does not include me? And he said, I represent the university.
So you heard that as a message like you're on your own, you're out there?
And so when they filed the ethics complaint, because I rather freely used the F word a few times in some of the, and I remember I woke up, pardon my language, I remember I woke up and there was all these emails from friends and colleagues saying, oh God, how can we help, I had no idea what was going on. Then I go on, I don't know if you guys know Gawker magazine. So on the front page of Gawker.
The late Gawker.
Gawker.
But anyway, yes.
Yeah, on the front page, I'll never forget, on the left, there's a headline, Beyonce's camel toe caught on film. On the right, there's a headline, woman arrested for masturbating while driving. And in the middle, there's a picture of me that says, Berkeley professor tells company, I ain't scared of you motherfuckers. And I think, oh my God. But I had no idea what was going on, And then I think, oh, my kid's gonna be embarrassed, And then I see my son on Facebook going, look what my dad did. But then I had to go, I got called in to my dean, and he said, we've an ethics complaint has been filed about some language that we've used. And I said, I came to you guys, and I said, look, these guys, and I said, you said I was on my own. And I said, I never sent an email from a university server. I never sent it from my university account. It's none of your business. I asked you to help. And at that point, the university lawyer, and then I had support from deans and professors from all over the world, literally wrote a long letter saying, look, this person has been harassed, and you didn't do anything. And then the university wrote a letter and said, stop harassing our colleague.
So in the end, the university stood up, or?
I don't know if they stood up. They did what they had to do.
Okay. So, there's so much. I mean, did you feel at this point, or at any point, that that you were being sort of materially hurt by this? Did it affect the funding for your labs, or did it affect job prospects that you had, or advancement?
Absolutely.
Prospects?
I had a job at Duke, a job offer at Duke.
And what happened?
Syngenta took it away. They told the Wall Street Journal that that Nicholas School, that they made some donations, and now you can see in their documents they say that Duke is right down the street from where we are, and we had to protect ourselves, and so we went to the university.
And what did Duke tell you at the time?
I had a job offer. My wife and I had even looked at houses here, and I got a phone call that said it's not going to happen. I had it in writing.
And in your lab or in other places at Berkeley, did you face difficulties? You were able to keep doing the research that you wanted to do, needed to do? It
became difficult, I think, because of the publicity and the media. It made me seem like somebody who was not corporate friendly. And the university at the time, and still is, at the time, for example, a fifth of the biological sciences in UC Berkeley was funded by Novartis. I mean, my deal was separate, but they had a big, I have a colleague that lost his career over also a fight with Novartis. And I think I was perceived as somebody who made it look like, it wasn't a corporate friendly place. And also, Berkeley made it difficult for me. They raised my fees to maintain animals on campus. I had to pay $100,000 a year. Just to have animals, just to do my experiments, have animals on campus. They also breached a contract where I had they had promised an endowment for my research that then they refused to honor. Until recently, they've honored it now. But
so, how do you feel like the context for this, of course, is atrazine, right? So you're going through this, battle, and so where's the EPA all of this time? You've published these results. Other people have confirmed them. They're being disputed by others, but you would expect at that point the regulatory bodies would step in and adjudicate this somehow. What was going on there?
Look, sorry, I didn't mean to say that way. So the panel for Syngenta, Novartis Syngenta that I worked on, was headed by a guy named Ron Kendall at the time. He was also on the EPA's endocrine disruptor screening and testing committee. He was also chair of the scientific advisory panel. Klaus Werner, who did research for Syngenta, was on the atrazine panel for the EPA.
So what was so what were they doing at this time? They were continuously ruling that there wasn't any basis to do it.
Despite the panel's recommendations, they were making policy to keep atrazine on the market because of that influence.
So do you feel, looking back on that period, and things have changed a little now, but looking back on that period, that the efforts to discredit you and discredit your work were actually successful for the company?
No.
No. So explain that. Why?
Well, what's the expression, that which does not kill you? I mean, the fact that they wrote down in their discredit Hayes, the fact that they wrote down this list of personal things that they were going to do to me shows me how strong my science was. Not my science, my students who conducted that work. If there was any, you can tear apart any experiment. Maybe the sample size should have been bigger, or maybe should have done it at this temperature, maybe. But the science was so tight that they had to go to exploit his father's health problems, investigate his wife. My science was so strong that they had to make threats to my wife and my daughter. So they I won't say they made me, but they learned a valuable lesson.
How much do you think your case, when you reflect on it, you think about the experience you've lived through and how it applies to broader questions of science and society, and these pressures between, relationships between private industry and universities, or between the government industries? What do you, how broad do you think this problem is?
I can't. So I worked with these guys. I can't, and let me be honest, when I first got involved, I thought, what if I were an artist? And what if you said, hey, I'll pay you $1,000 to paint me this way, and I want my hair to be browner, and then I give you the painting. It was a contract. And that's the way I approached it. It was like, okay, I'll do the experiment how you want. I'll give you the data, and it's yours. It's just a contract. But once I saw what they were asking me to do, and my fear was when I got involved that atrazine wouldn't do anything and I would look like I was on the payroll. But then when I saw how they wanted me to manipulate, I can't understand how anybody will do that. And I was working with people who would do it, who would do a bad experiment, or who would look at data that was the same as mine and then report to the media, oh, we didn't find anything. I'm like, what? Are we looking at the same data? Some of the students in class saw me. I can't understand how anybody could, I can't understand how, now you look through their notes and you find out these people, Steve Malloy and Alex Avery, these people who've written these op-ed pieces about me, it wasn't even them. They just paid somebody to put their name on something. I can't imagine doing that. I can't relate.
Yeah. So the media was a piece of this, right? So they were able to place articles about you in the media, and there was an article in Fortune magazine that was very critical of you, and others like that. How important was the use of the media and you've had positive things written about you as well, obviously, but how important were those pieces in forwarding their case? That's
also difficult for me to understand. Like when I did the New Yorker piece, the fact checking was, I was like, yeah, I think my name's Tyrone. The fact checking was so serious on everything. And then, Forbes magazine just publishes stuff that's factually not true. They publish these, this thing in Forbes that says I'm a high-paid expert witness. I've never, ever been paid anything. And all it would take is a phone call to say, hey, were you ever paid? Were you ever an expert witness? The things that they post on Wikipedia are just factually not true. I can't, I don't want to be self-righteous, but I can't understand that you'll make statements that for a fact aren't true.
There's this concept that's mentioned in the New Yorker piece. There's a New Yorker piece written about Dr. Hayes in 2014, right? I think so, yeah. And it takes up this issue of sound science, in quotation marks. So this is a notion not very well defined, but often used to describe industry or private commercial interest in shaping perception of scientific findings, to put it kindly. And it's often associated with tobacco or climate change or other things where there's a scientific objection raised to evidence that people in the scientific community think is pretty well founded. Does that have a bearing on what we're talking about here? Is this a broader movement in society to try to, one of the ways that it's said in the New Yorker piece is it's easier to challenge the science than it is to challenge the policy.
Yeah.
So that's where the battle occurs. Does that sound right to you, or is that what's happening?
Yeah, and again, they use sound science. Another term they like to throw is good laboratory practices. Because it's a set of criteria that most academic labs don't, and the irony is the GLP, good laboratory practices, were designed because industry often would lose samples or falsify data. So there's a sort of series of rules that you have to follow to make sure that happens. And I think what they're doing is they're putting that out in the public who doesn't have access to the original articles. And they'll say things over and over again like, oh, Hayes didn't turn in his raw data. This is not sound science. It was, his work has never been replicated. Well, that's true because nobody goes out and repeats the exact experiment that somebody else did. You just don't do that. But certainly there's been dozens and dozens of studies that have shown the same thing. Not with the same experimental design or species that I have, but certainly nobody's repeated exactly what I did.
So so the Data Quality Act, I understand, so that's the legislation that governs some of this. What does that require you to do? I mean, do you run up against that in your research?
Essentially, the Data Quality Act was written by a guy named Jim Tosey, who also worked for the tobacco industry. And essentially, it disallows any academic study. Essentially, if it's interpreted as it's written, it will only allow industry-funded studies to be considered by EPA. And so that act, when it was passed, the first use of the Data Quality Act was to try to kick my data out of the EPA's process because I'm in an academic laboratory, academic institution.
We talked a little bit about the university as a bureaucracy. Among your colleagues, either at Berkeley or elsewhere, and you alluded to other people have different relationships that might with funders or grant makers who might be different from your own. Did you receive a lot of support from colleagues? Did colleagues divide themselves over whether or not they were supportive as you went through this?
No, both at my institution and abroad, I have good. Like I said, my work was peer-reviewed in the best journals, and people know me as a scientist. And both on my campus as well as beyond, the only academics that I had issues with are ones that were being paid by this company, really.
So let's talk a little bit about that. We're almost at our marker here. So if you have questions, think about them. And we have a microphone here and one up there. But let's talk a little bit about the implications of all this and sort of where we are now. So as we talked about earlier, the EPA came out this summer and for the first time, really supported your work publicly and said, all this has, I'm going to try looking for the language here. The agency concluded that atrazine poses a potential serious risk to birds, mammals, fishes, frogs, as well as many plants it was not designed to kill. And then I guess they also then, as you mentioned, have a human impact study that's supposed to come out before the end of the year. So let's talk a little bit. We're at a weird political moment in the country right now. So what the future of those rulings might be is material to us. But tell us first, when this ruling came out over the summer, what was your reaction to it? And
well, again, I think I already said that I told you this 20 years ago.
And what do you think prompted it now?
I don't think it could have happened during the current administration. So, because all of that analysis, all of those data, that was there 4 years ago. I think that it's a very complicated political issue, and I had very little faith that anything would happen and move forward. And what little faith I had then, I certainly don't have now.
So you think that the ruling has been delayed until the end of the Obama term as a sort of like, let's say it, but then new clock.
Yep.
Was there anything in that study that, just tell us a little bit more about what they found. They also found that at very low concentrations of atrazine, it had a big effect. Can you just elaborate a little bit on what the EPA's position is now on atrazine?
Well, one of the things that I stressed and really pushed for when I was testifying before the EPA, et cetera, was, because they had a special scientific advisory panel meeting on amphibians. And what I stressed was don't drill down onto not just my study, but on it, look broadly at, right? Because if independent scientists are showing that atrazine affects reproductive development and physiology in fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, I could pick a hole in any study. I could say, if your sample size was 1,000, I can say, well, it should have been 10,000. There's no real rule, right? I mean, I could just make that up. I can say, well, you should have done it at 22 degrees rather than 24 degrees. But if you look broadly at all these studies, so don't ask me, has anybody replicated my study exactly? I think you have more faith if you have all these studies done in different animals in different ways and you're all getting the same result. And that's finally what the EPA did. That's why they can make the statement that you just read. Is they didn't ask, did Tyrone do his study right? They asked, how many studies are showing that this is problematic? And what's interesting is on that report now, none of the people, I don't believe, none of the original people from EPA who were supposed to be doing that analysis actually authored that paper. So they cleaned house and got a brand new group of people to really look at the analysis who seems like weren't as tainted by industry influence.
So, but they can't really put that genie back in the bottle, can they? I mean, they've said it. So let's talk about going forward. So, we're probably going to have a very industry-friendly director of the EPA, if we even have an EPA, and Donald Trump had suggested that he would eliminate the EPA. A ban on atrazine, is that a possibility at all, do you think?
If it wasn't a possibility in the last 8 years, I don't really see how it's going to be one now.
Mm-hmm. And how do you take on, so let's pull back from your work and take on the argument that Syngenta would make, or even consumers of the product would make. I mean, forget the company, farmers would make, in that of all the options available for treating crops, this is the most benign, it's the most stable, it's the least expensive, it's easy to use. I mean, all the things and that it does create this benefits through yield, and I think how do you think about those kinds of arguments?
I'll buy it.
Yeah.
Look, 20% of the world dies of starvation because they don't have access to staples. Corn is our #1 crop. Atrazine increases corn yield by some estimates 1.2%, and we eat less than 2% of the corn that we grow. It's not about feeding the world, and that message, all that rhetoric, is coming from the manufacturer. It's all about selling the chemical. And it's complicated because it's also tied up with the renewable fuels. Most of the corn that we grow goes to ethanol production. The biggest portion, 41% or something like that. We're eating less than 2%. It's not about feeding the world. And it's complicated by the fact that 90% of the seeds that we use to produce our food are owned by 6, soon to be 4 chemical companies. And those chemical companies are in the business of selling chemicals, and that's why 90% of GMO now, when I was in college, the promise of genetic engineering was drought-resistant wheat, then frost-resistant strawberries. 90% of it now is herbicide-resistant crops. So you have what's soon to be 4 companies owning 90% of the seeds and now modifying those seeds so they can sell more of their chemical. That's what they do. They don't feed the world.
Are you continuing to research in this area, or are you doing other things now?
We're continuing in the area now, looking at multiple generations, cross-generational effects. And I'm now campaigning to raise the funds to look more carefully at the role of atrazine and other chemicals in breast cancer. As you know, 13 out of 13 cancers, if you're a minority, you're more likely to die from those cancers. And we now know that less than 30% of cancer is due to genetics. It's an environmental disease, and minorities are more likely to live in and work in areas where they're exposed to chemicals. And just like with my frogs, I'm more interested now in the variability. Rather than taking one cell line, for example, that's not relevant to the women who are most likely to get breast cancer, more likely to die from breast cancer, I'm more interested in looking at variability and more interested in looking at how a history of exposure determines whether or not you're more vulnerable.
Right.
So we're trying to spread out and do that work now.
So before I turn it over to you, and I hope you have questions, I want to ask one more question, and that is, we have a room here with hopefully some future policymakers and maybe some future scientists or current scientists. So looking back on your experience here, and not just with Syngenta, but just in science in general, and the formation you bring to it, and the interests that you bring to it, what's some of the advice or some of the lessons that you would share with people starting out in this field who want to have sort of create an ethical path towards change by using the tools of science or policy?
Wow, that's a tough question, I think. I think definitely as scientists, we need to, although you have to be careful when you do it in your career, we need to be more interactive with the public. I often, when I give a talk, I have a quote from my PhD advisor who said, "Don't be an advocate, let the science speak for itself." And I don't think we can do that anymore. And one of the things that really impacted me was my first study was published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, one of the top, some would argue one of the top 3 scientific journals. And it was a big deal. I was coming up for tenure, and I remember telling my mom about it, and I remember my mom calling back and saying, "How important is that paper?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I went to Barnes & Noble, and they never heard of that magazine." And it made me realize that things that we use to judge each other in the ivory tower mean nothing to most of the world. And then I remember the EPA issued this statement that said regarding atrazine, they said the ultimate decision whether or not to ban atrazine is much bigger than science. It weighs in public opinion. And I immediately thought about my mom, that the EPA is counting on my mom to have an opinion, and I'm publishing in places and giving talks in places that she doesn't have access to, that most people don't have access to. And I think we really have to be more politically involved. And there's a quote now that I use from Einstein that says, those who have the privilege to know have the duty to act. So not only can you be a scientist and an advocate, at least some people think you have to be. That's your duty.
That's a motto for our times, if ever there was one. Yep. That's great. So, questions? And please, if you can, identify yourselves.
Hello. Hi. My name is Ade. I'm a PhD student here in the Sanford School. And my question kind of goes to your last point. As consumers of science, not necessarily your kinds of science, but where can we look for information on, kind of hot topics like GMOs and climate change, which is kind of has more consensus around it. But with things like GMOs in particular, it's really hard to kind of know.
Yeah.
Europe's banning them, the US says they're great. Where can we look for information if you're telling us that sometimes scientists are being paid to just have their names on it? People who publish in newspapers, where do we know how to find the truth?
I wish there was an easy answer. The web is a wonderful thing, but sometimes, I'll read stuff and I'm like, okay, come on. And if you don't have that training, how do you sort through? And I actually taught a class for freshmen non-science majors to try to, and these are people at Berkeley, and to try to figure out how to teach people how to look at the popular literature and then how to go back and figure out what the real science says. I see this thing with, so I hope I don't offend anybody, but with the vaccine issue, it's just not true. And how do you, without a science background, or let's say without a college education, how do you evaluate that? Especially with the internet. I can say I've more than once had to go to Snopes.com to figure something out myself, right? Because there are a lot of things that get posted, and I think it's a wonderful thing to have access to so much information, but I don't have an easy answer to how you sort through that and figure out what's real and what's not.
Hi, I'm Grant. I'm a senior here at Duke studying public policy. Out of curiosity, why do you think that Berkeley was so apathetic in supporting you until it received direct pressure to do so?
I think that Berkeley is a corporation. I think that I am an employee, and the people that I call students are customers to Berkeley. And I think that as somebody who was viewed from the outside as not corporate friendly, that I was a threat. I think that if I didn't have tenure when all this happened, I think they would have let me go. And I think that a lot of people go, well, it's Berkeley. But Berkeley is a historically public institution that's trying to be a Duke or Harvard without the long history of endowment that private institutions have. And so I think that they are less likely to protect academic freedom and to protect their scholars for that reason.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Hillary. I work in the industrial hemp and cannabis sector. It takes an inspiring amount of courage to fight the good fight in the way that you did against such a disgusting, coordinated, professional, and personal attack. It's clear that your science is strong, but so is your character. So can you speak to some of the intrinsic motivators and kind of internal attitudes and, sources of inspiration?
The first thing that comes to my mind is, in retrospect, and because of the way the media sort of portrayed the David and Goliath thing and all this interaction I have with Syngenta, the reason that I walked out of that contract was much simpler and much less noble than that. And I'll tell you what it is. My father never finished high school. And I remember my father used to come home from work. He laid carpet. And he said, the difference between employer and employee is a piece of paper on the wall. And he told me and my brothers, if you get the paper, nobody can tell you what to do. He used to say, never find yourself in a position where you let another man tell you when to get up in the morning, when to eat your lunch, and when to come home to your family. And the reason I walked out of that contract, much less noble than, now it's environmental justice and I'm concerned about all these things, was because when I wanted to publish and I wanted to ask people about my work, they told me I couldn't. And I immediately thought, but my dad said that once I had the paper, nobody could tell me what to do. That's why I walked out. All this other stuff came later. All the thinking about what it means to humans. But I'm a little boy who likes frogs. I wasn't thinking about, first time I ever heard the term environmental justice was when Keith Ellison in Minnesota invited me to give a talk there, and he started talking about these issues, and I started thinking about it, and Salinas and things. These things weren't on my mind. What was on my mind initially was that I would show that atrazine did nothing, and everybody would look at me as if I was on the payroll. So that was my initial motivator. And then thinking about now, my students. I have many students whose families are migrant farm workers and who work in the industry. Things that I never, ever thought about. All that stuff came later.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Hello.
Hi.
So you talked about farmers being exposed to atrazine at concentrations of about 2,400 times.
That's what's measured in their urine.
Okay.
They're probably exposed to much higher than that, yeah.
Okay. So times what you've seen in frogs. So I was wondering if you could articulate what effects we would be able to see in humans, if you could extrapolate up or scale up from the effects we've seen in frogs to the effects we could expect to see in humans, particularly minorities, since you said minorities have a tendency to be overexposed.
So what's been shown in humans is, because of course we don't do experiments, at least not on purpose, on humans. There's studies showing increased incidence of breast cancer in women whose well water is contaminated with atrazine, and there are rat models showing that rats fed atrazine develop mammary cancer, mammary problems. There's, in their factory in San Gabriel, Louisiana, a community is 80% black, there's an 8.4-fold higher incidence of prostate cancer in their workers who work in the room bagging the atrazine and breathing the dust compared to workers in the same factory but don't work in the room with atrazine. They published that, actually. There's a series of birth defects in humans, including something called gastrothesis, where the baby's born with the intestines on the outside of the body, choanal atresia, where the baby's born with a hole in the face. And more relevant to my work, there's studies showing that if you're pregnant with a son and you're exposed to atrazine, then you're more likely to be born with a son that has genital malformations that include microphallus, where the penis doesn't grow, that include cryptorchidism, where the testicles don't descend into the scrotum, and that include hypospadias, which is where the urethra doesn't end all the way through the penis. And what's interesting about the genital malformations is that the male genitalia depends on testosterone, and those malformations can be induced by estrogen exposure. And now you have a chemical that lowers testosterone and increases estrogen, and babies are more likely born with those malformations. And those studies are all backed up by experimental studies in rodents. So the company would argue that, well, it's just a correlation. But there are experimental studies in rodents that show those same kinds of things. If you're a rat, for example, exposed to atrazine, the male pups are born with the prostate of an old man. They're born with prostate disease. And now you have factory workers who breathe in the stuff and then they develop prostate cancer. So the data are out there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And who's talking about this at the policy level? You mentioned Representative Ellison or others. Are there others that are tuned into this?
I mean, I know I've testified quite a few times in Australia where they were trying to ban atrazine. Illinois had made some efforts. New York had made some efforts back before Spitzer had other issues to deal with. And Minnesota fought for years before Keith Ellison went to
Congress.
To Congress, yeah, when he was a state congressperson. I don't know that the bills moved at all, but I know it's been at least 8 years that it's been put in.
Right. Do you have a question?
Hi. My name's Olivia. I'm a UNC student, actually. I was wondering, you were talking about accepting money from industry, and as an ecology student, getting funding at all is difficult. So, like, the motivations for not accepting industry money, or the people who do accept it, is it more like financial, or is it they don't have the integrity of someone who?
Well, I mean, when I got involved, I was a young assistant professor, and I'm coming off of an academic generation when, like, my professor, for example, his professional life was funded by National Science Foundation. You just got one grant after another. You just got one NIH grant after another. Those days are gone. And so I was, at the time, being encouraged to diversify your portfolio and get money from here and money from there and always have, and as an academic, you have to do that now. It's even worse now, I'm sorry to say. And I guess in retrospect now, I would have thought more about the implications, and I would have been smarter about the contract. I actually made myself very vulnerable, right? Because the money actually, the funding that I had to do that work went from Syngenta to this company called EcoRisk to me, and then I took it on campus. So I actually had a libel contract, a confidentiality contract, which made me legally liable. I mean, I would have been much smarter about that if I were doing it now. And I don't think necessarily that all corporate funding has to be bad. I think you just have to be smart about how. I mean, the one thing I was smart about is I didn't have any students on that funding. So I didn't have anybody who was counting on their degrees to do that research. I mean, that I was very careful about. But I had money, I had funding from a water company. And their interest was, we don't care the outcome, but if there are bad things in the water, I need to know about it. And so this is an investment for me. And it was a very nice relationship. So it doesn't necessarily have to be bad.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, so my name is Rosa Castro, and I come from the Initiative for Science and Society. So this is very much a core question for all of us from the ethical and the policy point of view. And I wonder, in your experience, you mentioned like several other countries have adopted a different approach to the same problem. What do you think is different, if you have any guess about what lessons can be learned here in the US to handle with new technologies in general?
Well, I always sort of say sarcastically that the European Union has had such a long history of screwing up their environment that they're much more cautious now. So the European Union uses a precautionary principle that essentially says if there's a chemical in the water, the company has to prove that it's safe, otherwise it's banned. And that's how they got rid of atrazine. Whereas in the US, it's innocent until proven guilty. And the company's financially charged with showing that that chemical's bad. So it's less likely to happen here. I can tell you, for example, there was a big conference that was attended by the National Institutes of Health and EPA, a bunch of other, USDA, and the conference was on precautionary principle and whether or not it should be used in the US. And you know where it was held? Berlin. We couldn't even have it. We don't even have that discussion in the US. And all of the government agencies had to stand up and say, I'm here representing myself, not my agency. They had to go on their own time. Couldn't even happen in this country. So it's very different. In terms of other countries, I think basically they follow the US, or there's less stringent rules in other countries about pesticide use. Even Hawaii. I mean, I've been involved in legislation in Hawaii. The rules there, like the Clean Water Act and things, they're allowed to not follow that. in Hawaii. I don't know if it's legal or not, but they have much bigger issues even in Hawaii than we have here.
Atrazine's been a material for the trade deal between Europe and the United States, right? I mean, so there's been negotiation about.
I think so, yeah.
There.
Hi, I'm Dorian Canellis. I'm on the chemistry faculty here at Duke. I know when Freon got banned for depleting the ozone hole that it was replaced by hydrofluorocarbons, which are now also banned for depleting the ozone layer. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are if atrazine gets banned, who will be manufacturing the replacement, and what will the replacement be? Or would farmers be willing to not have anything as a replacement? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I can tell you it's already happened, actually. So in the European Union, there are notes from Syngenta talking about terbutylazine. And in their notes, they say terbutylazine, they actually write this in their handwriting. Terbutylazine is worse than atrazine, does the same thing at lower doses, causes mammary cancer, causes testicular cancer. They wrote that in the year that they replaced atrazine with terbutylazine. So somebody sat in a room and wrote down, here's this chemical, we know it's worse, and let's send it to Europe. It differs by one methyl group. So it's already been done. The bill that Keith Ellison wrote was to ban all triazines, the whole class. But that's what happened in Europe. They replaced it with something else that they knew was worse.
Do you see an alternative to it, or do people speak about it? How do you think about that?
I think when you have a chemical that increases yield by 1.2% of a crop that we eat less than 2% of, I think we need to rethink what agriculture means in this country and how we're doing it. I mean, if we can have other conversations where I'd be like, where we're talking about what are the costs and benefits of a chemical, where I'd be like, it's a difficult one. But for something that increases yield by 1.2%, for something that we eat less than 2% of, I think it's a no-brainer. I mean, I don't want to go into a long story, but I remember we had near my house, so I live in the Oakland Hills, and there was a big controversy a few years ago that they wanted to ban some herbicide that I knew nothing about, I hadn't heard of, and they wanted me to testify. And the problems are that a non-native plant called Scotch broom grows there, and I guess it's a fire hazard. And Oakland Hills, 30 years ago burned. Most of the neighborhoods burned down, so that's a real issue. But if they pull it or use the goats, apparently it creates a mudslide issue. And so here they wanted to use this herbicide, which sounds awful. We're going to spray herbicides in the park, but you got to weigh that against, fire and mudslide for a chemical that we don't really know what the side effects are. That's a difficult question. But a chemical that increases yield by 1.2% of a crop that we eat less than 2% of, that we know causes all this environmental and public health hazard, to me, that's a no-brainer. I would even argue, some people get upset with me, but I would even argue when we talk about things like DDT and spraying it on walls in Africa as, to try to prevent malaria and yellow fever, I think that's a tough question. But this one, I think, is a no-brainer.
Hello, Caitlin. I'm a master's student here at Sanford in Public Policy Program. My question, I really liked your Albert Einstein quote about taking action. And I know that different states tried to pass more rigorous chemical policies, and that last year, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the Toxic Substance Control Act was reformed for the first time since the 1970s, but it actually trumps state efforts to have more rigorous chemical policies.
Please don't use that word.
I know. I couldn't think of the other word. Sorry. But that actually leads into the next part of my question, which is now that we have this federal policy that overrides state policy, and we're facing an administration that most likely won't enforce it adequately, or it might be repealed, or whatever might happen. Terrifying. Because I will be a policymaker, I'm racking my brain. I know that atrazine is just one chemical of many, many, many chemicals that are under-regulated in the United States. And I'm wondering if you have any ideas or suggestions for other avenues, like maybe worker safety policy, or even just individual action that people can take to try to minimize exposure or help minority populations that have disparate exposure to these chemicals.
I've personally taken every opportunity that I could, whether it's public speaking or documentaries or working with, testifying before EPA. Like I said, I worked with the lawyers who did the lawsuit. I've also worked with several legislators to try to write policy. What's going to happen in the next 4 years, anybody's guess is as good as mine. And like I said, it's been difficult now. I mean, I know, there's individual states can have more stringent regulations than federal. California just recognized atrazine as a reproductive toxin and now has to be labeled in California. Wisconsin, I know, bans atrazine county by county, depending on where it shows up. So there are individual things you can do on the local level. The EPA have open public comment periods on not just atrazine, on anything. So anybody, I didn't know this until I got involved. So anybody can go to the EPA's website and, does this comment that it weighs in public opinion. Anybody can go in and get involved and know. But most of the chemical, if you Googled, Google Scholar or Web of Science or whatever, if you looked at the top 10 agricultural chemicals, you might find glyphosate, atrazine, and maybe 2,4-D. There's a good number of papers. The rest, nothing. We don't know anything. I mean, somebody probably knows, but it's not public. It's not available even to us as scientists. I mean, like Syngenta always makes this claim that they've done over 6,000 studies. I mean, they're certainly not published studies. So in terms of knowing which chemicals are and which ones to go after, most of it we have no idea.
Do you see opposition to GMOs as being an avenue to reduce the amounts of pesticides and herbicides being used?
Here's my issue with GMO. I've been asked, I did a whole tour, for example, in Hawaii, 7-day tour on 5 of the islands or something like that, mostly because of anti-GMO. I don't know of data showing that GMOs themselves have any kind of public health or environmental risk. I'm not saying they're safe. I'm just saying I've never seen any convincing data. But 90% of GMO goes to make plants herbicide resistant. So it's making us dependent on chemicals. And so my issue with GMO is that, I'm remembering now, I'm forgetting now where I said what. I don't remember if I said this before, but 90% of the seeds that we use are owned by 4 chemical companies. And so they're modifying the seed to get us hooked on the chemical. That's my issue with GMO, is the overuse of chemicals and the way it's being used to sell more chemicals, to get us more reliant on chemicals rather than moving us away from that. I also take the position that there should be a right to know. There should be labeling, that it doesn't matter if it's safe or not. If I want a pear, then label it a pear, because I don't want, if I want a pear and not an apple, then I want a pear. Label it so I know what it is. And to me, it should have nothing to do with whether or not it's safe. It should be my right to know what I'm buying, and my right to choose, and my right to vote with my dollars. That's what I think is important.
Thank you.
So we can continue the discussion upstairs at a reception, but for right now, I want to thank you, Dr. Hayes, for this great talk. Thank you. Thank you very much.